They always tell us that history is written by the victors, but that is a comfortable, sterile lie. True history is not penned with golden ink in the air-conditioned offices of Washington or London. It is written in the impenetrable, rotting mud, using the blood of the very men the system first betrayed and then desperately tried to erase from every official archive. If you open the classified government reports regarding the secret campaign in San Dior in 1968, you will only find neat tables of acceptable casualties and heavily redacted paragraphs about successful enemy containment. You will never find a single mention of Echo Company, and you will absolutely never find a single word about Sergeant Marcus Vance, a man whom his own high command sentenced to certain death, simply because his tactical genius and the color of his skin were an unforgivable insult to their own suffocating arrogance. To fully comprehend the chilling depth of the betrayal that unfolded in the sweltering jungles of San Dior, you first have to descend to the absolute bottom of the military food chain. Echo Company was not an army unit. It was a penal cesspool for the unwanted. This is where the military dumped its deserters, its violent insubordinates, its thieves, and its psychopaths. They were handed rusted, decommissioned rifles, issued expired body armor, and quietly deployed to the most malarial, hopeless, God-forsaken sectors of the front line. Command did not expect them to achieve victory. Command fully expected them to die, conveniently saving the taxpayer budget the cost of military tribunals and federal prisons. Ruling over this heavily armed mob of outcasts was Captain Arthur Crawford. An elite military academy graduate with a flawless aristocratic pedigree, Crawford's once promising career had violently derailed after a documented incident of battlefield cowardice. He hated the suffocating jungle. He hated the war. But most of all, he harbored a deep, sadistic hatred for his own men, viewing them as disposable, genetic trash. Yet within this company of the damned, there was one single soldier whose mere presence triggered a feral, uncontrollable rage within Crawford. That man was Marcus Vance. Just 6 months prior, Marcus Vance had been recognized as one of the most brilliant, unorthodox, tactical minds in his entire division. A black kid from the unforgiving neighborhoods of Detroit, he had violently clawed his way up the ranks through sheer, undeniable intellect and a will of iron. He saw a chaotic battlefield with the cold precision of a grandmaster looking at a chessboard. But when a highly connected white general arrogantly ignored Vance's explicit intelligence warnings, blindly marching a full battalion straight into a devastating meat grinder of an ambush, the system immediately needed a scapegoat. They were not going to court-martial a general with powerful friends in the Senate. Instead, they meticulously fabricated the after-action reports. They accused Vance of criminal negligence and failure to execute orders. They publicly, gleefully, ripped his officer's insignia from his collar, trampled his dignity into the dirt, and threw him into Echo Company, right into the waiting arms of the very criminals and rejects who were now supposed to be his brothers in arms. But if you believe that men automatically unite in the face of shared death at the bottom of the abyss, you are profoundly mistaken. For the white penal soldiers of Echo Company, the sudden arrival of a disgraced black officer was not a call for solidarity. It was the ultimate, helpless target for them to project their own miserable failures onto. They did not see a tactical genius. They saw a man they could finally, legally, brutalize without consequence. Imagine the suffocating, sticky heat of that tropical rainforest. The temperature hovering near 100 degrees, the air thick with mosquitoes, and the sickeningly sweet smell of rotting vegetation. The company is on a grueling, miles-long, forced march. While the white soldiers take their breaks, smoking cheap cigarettes, laughing, and drinking warm water from their canteens, Marcus Vance is silently carrying the agonizingly heavy steel base plates for the mortars, along with crates of surplus ammunition, a grueling, back-breaking labor that Captain Crawford ordered to be placed exclusively on his shoulders. The soldiers point at him. They laugh loudly, making filthy, degrading jokes about his background, his race, and how pathetic the great genius officer looks now that he's been reduced to a pack mule. They intentionally bump their shoulders into him as they walk past, trying to shove him into the deep, sucking mud. Captain Crawford watches all of this from a comfortable distance, a thin, sinister smirk on his face. He is eagerly waiting for Vance to snap. He wants Vance to drop the crate and throw a punch at a white soldier, because the exact second he does, Crawford will have the legal, undeniable right to execute him on the spot for mutiny in a combat zone. But Vance refused to break. He would silently push himself up from the mud, wipe the filthy water from his face with the back of his hand, hoist the impossibly heavy crate back onto his bleeding shoulders, and keep walking. His face remained as impenetrable as black granite. There was no fear in his eyes, and absolutely no plea for mercy. He looked right through them. Vance possessed the terrifying, quiet stoicism of a man who knows with absolute certainty that the system can strip his rank, tear his uniform, and force him to eat dirt. But it can never, ever take his mind. He endured the relentless humiliation because his singular, burning objective was survival. He was meticulously studying every laughing soldier, cataloging every single weakness of Captain Crawford, and memorizing every hidden trail in that cursed jungle. He was a tightly coiled spring, waiting for the inevitable moment when their fake illusion of control would violently shatter, and this mob of laughing rejects would desperately need a real leader to keep them from being slaughtered. And that moment was hurtling toward them with the speed of an incoming artillery shell. Because in just a few days, Echo Company would receive a direct order that would forever alter the course of this forgotten war. An order that was nothing more than an officially stamped death sentence. In the sterile, map-lined briefing rooms of division headquarters, they called it Strategic Objective 81. But to the men on the ground, the nameless, jagged peak rising out of the Sandior jungle was just Hill 81, a steep, unforgiving monolith of mud, razor grass, and exposed rock. The High Command needed a distraction. Intelligence had indicated a massive enemy offensive was building in the sector, and the brass needed to buy time to fortify their primary bases. They needed a sacrificial lamb to draw the enemy's fire, to bleed their momentum, and to act as an early warning system. They did not send their elite airborne units. They did not send the mechanized infantry. They boxed up the expendables of Echo Company, handed them coordinates, and told them to hold the hill at all costs. When Captain Arthur Crawford received the operational orders over the encrypted radio, his blood ran cold. He knew exactly how to read a tactical map, and he immediately understood the grim mathematics of the assignment. This was not a defensive posture. It was a tethered goat waiting for the slaughter. Echo Company was being positioned directly in the primary invasion corridor, but Crawford, ever the survivor of his own cowardice, immediately began to engineer a way to ensure that when the inevitable slaughter happened, his own uniform would not get a single drop of blood on it. Upon arriving at the base of Hill 81, Crawford gathered his lieutenants and issued his deployment orders. He declared that the command center needed to be established in a reinforced, naturally shielded ravine at the far rear of the hill, safely tucked behind tons of solid rock and thick jungle canopy, completely out of the direct line of sight of the enemy approach. He hoarded the best communication equipment, the heavy machine guns, and the bulk of the medical supplies for his own perimeter. Then, he turned his attention to the forward slope, the steepest, most exposed, and utterly defenseless face of the hill that stared directly into the abyss of the enemy's territory. Crawford called out the names of the men he despised the most, the absolute bottom of his penal barrel. And at the very top of that list, naturally, was Sergeant Marcus Vance. Crawford ordered Vance and a small detachment of the most hostile, undisciplined white convicts to march up to the exposed forward ridge. Their orders were simple. Dig shallow foxholes in the rock-hard dirt, set up a meager perimeter with their rusted rifles, and serve as the advanced warning element. As Vance grabbed his entrenching tool and began the exhausting climb up the muddy slope, the white soldiers in his detail continued their relentless mocking. They laughed at the absurdity of the situation, oblivious to the reality of the trap. They thought this was just another one of Crawford's sadistic punishments, another excuse to make the disgraced black officer sweat and suffer in the blistering sun. They spat in the dirt near Vance's boots, complaining about the heat and the lack of rations, entirely confident that the war was miles away. But Vance did not laugh. As he reached the crest of the forward slope and looked out over the vast, unbroken ocean of green jungle stretching toward the horizon, his brilliant tactical mind immediately pieced together the horrifying reality. He saw the natural choke points, He felt the ominous, unnatural silence of the tree line.
He looked back down the hill and saw Crawford's men fortifying the rear, effectively trapping Vance's detail at the top, with no avenue of retreat.
Marcus Vance drove his shovel into the hard earth with a chilling realization. This was not a punishment detail. It was an execution. Crawford had intentionally placed them on an altar, fully expecting them to be annihilated in the first wave, buying the captain enough time to radio for a helicopter extraction and flee before the enemy ever reached his bunker. The white soldiers around Vance were still cracking jokes and trading insults, completely blind to the fact that they were already dead men walking. But Vance was not going to die quietly on this hill, and he certainly was not going to let a coward dictate his final stand. He began to dig, not just a trench, but a fortress, preparing for the storm that only he knew was coming. The jungle night did not fall on Hill 81. It slammed down like a suffocating, pitch-black vault. The oppressive heat broke, replaced by a chilling, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the insects. Up on the exposed forward slope, the relentless mocking from the white penal soldiers finally died out. It was not replaced by discipline, but by a creeping, primal dread. They sat in their shallow, hastily dug foxholes, gripping their rusted rifles, staring into the impenetrable wall of darkness. Marcus Vance, however, was already moving. He was checking sightlines, repositioning ammunition crates, and silently calculating the exact trajectory of the inevitable assault. He knew the silence was not peace. It was the deep breath before a scream. At 0200 hours, the horizon violently tore itself apart. The first incoming artillery shell did not just explode. It permanently altered the geography of the ridge. A blinding flash of orange and white magnesium illuminated the jungle, followed instantly by a concussive shockwave that lifted men off their feet and hurled them into the mud. Then, the sky opened up. It was a perfectly synchronized, highly coordinated barrage of mortar and rocket fire designed to turn the forward slope of Hill 81 into a churning meat grinder. The earth boiled. Trees were instantly vaporized into flying wooden shrapnel. The white convicts, who had spent the entire afternoon spitting near Vance's boots and bragging about their toughness, immediately broke. The illusion of their superiority evaporated in the white-hot forge of actual combat. They dropped their weapons, pressed their faces into the filthy water of their trenches, and began to scream for their mothers, entirely paralyzed by a terror they had never known existed. Down in the reinforced, naturally shielded ravine at the rear of the hill, Captain Arthur Crawford felt the bunker shake. He peered through the observation slit, his face illuminated by the flickering, hellish glow of the bombardment tearing apart the forward ridge. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the enemy artillery instantly confirmed his darkest assumption. This was not a skirmish. This was a massive, division-strength offensive. Echo Company was not going to slow them down. Echo Company was going to be erased from existence in a matter of minutes. A true commanding officer would have immediately ordered his heavy weapons teams to provide covering fire. He would have called in danger-close artillery support to protect his forward elements. But Crawford was not a leader. He was an aristocratic survivalist. He turned away from the observation slit, his uniform still perfectly clean, and walked over to the primary communications officer. Crawford picked up the heavy, encrypted radio receiver. He did not call for artillery support. He called battalion command, his voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed, feigned panic. He reported that Hill 81 had already been completely overrun by an overwhelming enemy force, that the forward elements were entirely wiped out, and that he required an immediate, priority dust-off extraction for essential command personnel. He was officially abandoning his post, leaving 80 men to die and dressing it up as a tactical withdrawal. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a Huey extraction chopper echoed faintly over the deafening roar of the mortar shells. The helicopter approached low and fast from the rear, shielded by the mountain, touching down just long enough for Crawford and his hand-picked lieutenants to scramble aboard. But before Crawford stepped onto the skids of the chopper, he turned back to his radio man, who was frantically trying to relay distress signals from the forward ridge. Crawford's eyes were dead and cold. "Smash the comms," Crawford ordered. The young radio man froze, staring at the captain in horror. Destroying the main radio meant the men bleeding and dying on the forward slope would have absolutely no way to call for air support, no way to request a medical evacuation, and no way to report that their commanding officer had just deserted them. They would be deaf, blind, and completely cut off from the rest of the United States military. "I said, smash it," Crawford repeated, slowly resting his hand on the grip of his holstered sidearm. With a shaking hand, the radio man picked up a heavy steel wrench and brought it down on the radio terminal. Glass shattered, wires sparked, and the only lifeline tethering Echo Company to the outside world was violently severed. Up on the bleeding, burning crest of Hill 81, through the thick, choking clouds of cordite and smoke, the penal soldiers looked back toward the rear bunker, desperately praying for the heavy machine guns to open up and save them. Instead, they saw the flashing red strobe light of Crawford's helicopter lifting off over the canopy, banking hard and disappearing into the safety of the night sky. The realization hit them harder than the artillery. The elite establishment had thrown them into the fire, locked the door, and flown away. The white soldiers who had spent the march mocking their black sergeant were now completely shattered, weeping in the mud, surrounded by an advancing enemy force, entirely abandoned by their own blood. The massacre was seconds away, and there was no one left to save them. No one, except the man they had relentlessly tried to destroy. The red strobe light of Captain Crawford's extraction chopper faded into the black canopy, taking with it the last shred of the United States military establishment. Up on the forward slope, the realization of their absolute abandonment hit the penal soldiers of Echo Company harder than the mortar shells that were currently reshaping the earth around them. For a few agonizing seconds, there was a terrifying, breathless vacuum on the ridge. Then, the tree line below them erupted. It was not just artillery anymore. It was the chilling, metallic shrill of whistles, followed by the guttural battle cries of an advancing infantry wave. Through the flashing, strobing light of the explosions, the white soldiers could see hundreds of silhouettes pouring out of the jungle, charging up the muddy incline. Panic is not a choice. It is a primal, biological virus, and it swept through Echo Company with devastating speed. The very men who had spent the entire afternoon bragging about their street toughness and mocking Sergeant Vance, now completely shattered. A heavily tattooed soldier named Miller, the loudest, most vicious bully of the platoon, dropped his rusted M16 into the mud. Screaming incoherently, he scrambled out of his shallow foxhole, his eyes wide with blind, animalistic terror. He was preparing to run toward the rear, completely forgetting that the rear was an unfortified, open expanse that would leave him exposed to the enemy's flanking fire. "We're dead! They left us!" Miller shrieked, his voice cracking as other soldiers began to drop their weapons and follow his lead, infected by the absolute certainty of their own slaughter. They were seconds away from a full-blown rout, a chaotic stampede that would end with every single one of them being cut down from behind. But as Miller took his first panic step toward the rear, a massive, unyielding force collided with his chest. It was Marcus Vance. He did not yell. He did not ask for order. He moved with the terrifying, coiled speed of a predator that had just been unleashed from its cage. Vance grabbed Miller by the thick canvas webbing of his tactical harness, lifted the heavy soldier completely off his feet, and violently slammed him backward into the muddy wall of the trench. The impact knocked the wind out of Miller, snapping his jaw shut. Vance pressed his forearm against Miller's throat, his face inches away, his eyes burning with a cold, absolute authority that cut through the deafening roar of the battlefield. "You run, you die tired in the mud," Vance roared, his voice possessing a metallic, unmistakable command that none of these men had ever heard from him before. He shoved Miller's discarded rifle back into his trembling hands. "You want to live? You look at me! You listen to me!" Vance did not wait for a response. He spun around, stepping out of the trench and standing fully exposed to the incoming fire. While the white soldiers cowered, paralyzed by fear, Vance began to read the chaotic battlefield as if it were a perfectly lit chessboard. His tactical genius, the very thing the corrupt generals had tried to erase, was instantly resurrected in the crucible of combat. He saw the enemy's flanking maneuver before it even materialized. He identified the fatal gaps in their pathetic, hastily dug perimeter. He began barking orders, physically grabbing paralyzed men by their helmets and throwing them into new firing positions. "Get on that .30 caliber, traverse right, aim for the tree stumps. That's their natural funnel," Vance ordered, kicking an ammunition crate open and feeding the belt into the heavy machine gun himself. "You two, move 20 yards left, set up a crossfire. Do not shoot until they hit the razor wire." The white convicts hesitated for a fraction of a second, But as they looked up at the disgraced black sergeant, the man they had spat on, shoved, and humiliated for months, they did not see an outcast. They saw a god of war. They saw the only human being on Hill 81 who was not afraid of the dark. The aristocratic white captain, with the spotless uniform, had locked the door and left them to burn. The black sergeant they had treated like an animal was standing in the fire, holding the roof up with his bare hands. The paradigm shifted with violent, immediate necessity. Racism requires the luxury of safety, and there was no safety left on Hill 81. Survival overrode prejudice. Miller racked the bolt of his M16, swallowed his blood, and opened fire. The heavy machine gun roared to life exactly where Vance had positioned it, instantly cutting down a dozen advancing enemy soldiers who had tried to exploit the funnel Vance had anticipated. The chaotic, terrified mob of Echo Company suddenly found a rhythm. Under Vance's iron grip, the penal unit crystallized into a brutal, highly efficient killing machine. Vance was everywhere. He was carrying crates of grenades through the mortar fire. He was patching up bleeding men in the mud. He was firing his own weapon with surgical, devastating precision. He was not just commanding the hill, he owned it. For the first time in their miserable, discarded lives, the outcasts of Echo Company had a leader who did not view them as acceptable losses. And in return, they began to fight not for the United States government, not for Captain Crawford, but strictly for Sergeant Marcus Vance. But the night was only just beginning, and the enemy was bringing up their heavy armor. The true test of Vance's mind, and the true cost of their survival, was about to be paid in blood. If the first wave of the assault was a test of nerve, the hours that followed were a grueling, mechanical meat grinder designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance. The enemy realized that the forward slope of Hill 81 had not crumbled as their intelligence predicted. Instead, they had run headfirst into a meticulously orchestrated buzzsaw. Enraged by the resistance of what they assumed was a crippled detachment, the enemy commanders escalated the attack, feeding wave after wave of infantry into the choke points that Sergeant Marcus Vance had so brilliantly constructed. For the next 6 hours, time ceased to exist. There was only the deafening, rhythmic hammering of the .30 caliber machine gun, the blinding flashes of grenades, and the metallic smell of hot brass and freshly spilled blood mixing with the damp earth. The penal soldiers of Echo Company, men who had been entirely written off by their own country, fought like cornered wolves. They fired until their rifle barrels glowed cherry red in the dark. They fought with entrenching tools and bare hands when the enemy breached the wire. But it was not just raw adrenaline keeping them alive. It was the unmistakable presence of Marcus Vance. He moved through the chaotic trench line like a ghost, completely unfazed by the shrapnel tearing the bark off the trees inches from his head. His tactical foresight was bordering on the supernatural. When the enemy tried to shift their attack to the vulnerable left flank, Vance was already there, having quietly relocated a squad of riflemen 5 minutes prior. When the enemy mortars adjusted their trajectory, Vance ordered his men to abandon their foxholes and move 20 yards forward, letting the artillery shells fall harmlessly behind them into empty dirt. He was not just fighting the battle, he was directing it, predicting the enemy's moves with a cold, terrifying precision that left the white soldiers in a state of absolute awe. But no amount of tactical genius can completely stop the horrific mathematics of war. By 0400 hours, the ammunition was running critically low, and the line was fracturing. During a particularly brutal push, a localized artillery strike shattered the center of Echo Company's perimeter. The concussive blast threw several men into the air, creating a massive, smoking crater just outside the primary trench line. As the smoke briefly cleared under the pale light of a flare, the surviving men saw a horrific sight. Lying at the bottom of that exposed crater, completely pinned down by a crossfire of heavy machine guns, was Miller, the heavily tattooed instigator who had spent the entire month leading the racial abuse against Vance. Miller's leg was shattered. He was trying to drag himself backward through the mud, screaming in agony, while enemy tracers snapped just inches above his helmet. He was in no man's land. To step out of the trench to get him was a guaranteed death sentence. The other white soldiers, Miller's supposed friends, pressed themselves hard against the dirt wall, paralyzed by the sheer volume of lead cutting through the air above the crater. They looked away. They had accepted that Miller was already dead. Marcus Vance did not look away. This was the man who had called him an animal. This was the man who had purposely kicked dirt into his rations and laughed about the Jim Crow laws back home. By every law of nature and every metric of human vengeance, Vance should have let the enemy finish the job. It would have been the perfect poetic justice for a broken system. Instead, Vance dropped his empty rifle. He did not issue an order. He did not hesitate. With a feral roar, the disgraced black sergeant vaulted over the safety of the sandbags and sprinted directly into the kill zone. The white soldiers watched in stunned, breathless disbelief as Vance dove into the smoking crater. Bullets kicked up geysers of mud all around him, tearing through his uniform. Vance grabbed the screaming, bleeding Miller by the straps of his webbing. He did not just pull him, he used his own body as a physical shield, placing himself directly between the enemy guns and the man who had tormented him. With a surge of superhuman strength, Vance dragged the heavy soldier up the slick, muddy lip of the crater and threw him headfirst back into the safety of the American trench, diving in right behind him, just as a mortar shell obliterated the spot they had occupied a second before. Vance collapsed into the mud next to Miller, chest heaving, his uniform soaked in both of their blood. He did not ask for a thank you. He simply grabbed a fresh magazine from a dead soldier's pouch, slammed it into his weapon, and racked the bolt, his eyes already scanning the tree line for the next wave. Miller lay in the filth, clutching his shattered leg. The agony in his body was entirely eclipsed by the violent psychological earthquake tearing through his mind. He looked up at the black man who was currently laying down covering fire to protect him. All the arrogant, racist lies Miller had been fed his entire life, all the systemic hatred he had so proudly worn like a badge of honor, instantly dissolved in the blood-soaked reality of Hill 81. The aristocratic white captain in the clean uniform had left him to die like a dog. The black outcast had just traded his own life to pull him from hell. In that single, agonizing moment, the racial divide of Echo Company was completely, permanently annihilated. They were no longer white convicts and a black scapegoat. They were blood brothers, forged in a fire that the establishment could never understand. When the sun finally breached the jagged canopy of the San Dior jungle, it did not bring warmth to Hill 81. It only illuminated the unimaginable scale of the slaughter. The deafening, earth-shattering roar of the night assault had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the hiss of cooling rifle barrels and the groans of the wounded. The thick, acrid smoke of cordite and burned phosphorus hung low over the churned mud like a burial shroud. As the pale morning light washed over the forward slope, the surviving penal soldiers of Echo Company slowly pushed themselves up from the rims of their shattered foxholes. They looked out over the perimeter and saw the terrifying confirmation of what they had endured. The tree line was completely decimated, and piled in front of the razor wire, bottlenecked exactly at the kill zones and firing angles that Sergeant Marcus Vance had calculated, were the bodies of the enemy. Hundreds of them. The crippled detachment of military outcasts had not just survived a division-level assault, they had broken its back. But the true transformation of Hill 81 had not happened on the battlefield. It had happened in the minds of the men sitting in the mud. The white convicts of Echo Company were entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, sneering mob that had marched up the mountain the day before. Their faces were blackened with soot, their uniforms stiff with dried mud and blood. They sat slumped against the sandbags, utterly exhausted, staring at the destruction with hollow, thousand-yard stares. And then there was Marcus Vance. He was sitting on an empty ammunition crate in the center of the trench line. His helmet was off, resting in the dirt beside him. His uniform was torn to shreds, and a deep gash on his shoulder was slowly soaking his sleeve in dark blood from where he had dove into the crater to save Miller. He did not look like a god of war anymore. He just looked like a profoundly tired man who had carried the weight of the world through the darkest night of his life. He was quietly field stripping his rifle, his hands steady, mechanically cleaning the carbon from the bolt. The men watched him. The silence in the trench was absolute, but it was no longer the silence of resentment. It was the heavy, sacred silence of absolute reverence. Miller, his shattered leg heavily bandaged and splinted with a broken rifle stock, was propped up against the dirt wall. The heavily tattooed instigator, the man who had spewed the most venomous racist poison just 24 hours earlier, looked at Vance. There were no grand speeches. There were no tearful apologies. Men of that era, broken by the system and forged in the gutter,
did not have the vocabulary for that.
They communicated in the raw, unspoken currency of survival. Miller reached down with a trembling hand and unclipped his steel canteen from his webbing. It was the last half pint of clean water on the entire forward ridge. He did not drink from it. He simply held it out toward Vance. Another soldier, a kid from the deep south who had spent the march intentionally shoving Vance into the mud, stood up. He took the canteen from Miller, walked over to the ammunition crate, and silently handed it to the black sergeant. Vance stopped cleaning his rifle. He looked up at the young white soldier, his dark eyes reading the profound tectonic shift in the boy's soul. Vance took the canteen, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow, measured drink. He then wiped the rim with his thumb and handed it back. The young soldier took a drink from the exact same canteen, from the exact same rim, and passed it down the line. In that single, quiet exchange of a steel canteen, the deeply entrenched, systemic racism of the 1960s was completely annihilated on Hill 81. The color of a man's skin, the fabricated reports of corrupt generals, the Jim Crow laws of their hometowns, none of it survived the artillery barrage. The fire had burned away the arrogant illusions of the establishment, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. Marcus Vance was no longer the outcast. He was no longer the scapegoat. He was their commander, their savior, and their brother. They had conquered the hill. They had conquered themselves. But as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, a new, sickening sound began to echo from the rear of the valley. It was the rhythmic, heavy thumping of Huey helicopter blades. The United States military establishment was returning to Hill 81, and Captain Arthur Crawford, the aristocrat who had left them to die in the dark, was coming back to collect the medals for a victory he had absolutely no part in winning. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of the Huey rotors cut through the sacred quiet of the morning, a sickening reminder that the establishment was coming to collect its dues. Down in the rear ravine, the exact spot from which Captain Arthur Crawford had cowardly fled hours earlier, 3 transport helicopters touched down. Out stepped Captain Crawford, followed by a heavily armed detachment of military police and a combat photographer. Crawford's fatigues were still perfectly pressed. His boots were entirely free of the blood and mud that coated the men of Hill 81. His plan was brilliantly, sociopathically simple. He had returned to document the heroic last stand of his brave company, write a glowing, tragic after-action report about how they fought to the last bullet under his strategic guidance, and pin a silver star to his own pristine chest. He was ready to walk through a graveyard of scapegoats. But as Crawford and his entourage climbed the steep, smoking path to the forward slope, the comfortable illusion of his career was violently shattered. He did not find a graveyard. He found a fortress. Crawford stopped dead in his tracks as he crested the ridge. His jaw tightened. He looked at the hundreds of enemy bodies tangled in the razor wire. He looked at the perfectly positioned, overlapping machine gun nests that no penal unit could have engineered on their own. And then, he looked at the surviving men of Echo Company. They were not dead. They were sitting in the trenches, leaning on their weapons, their eyes locked entirely on him. These were not the broken, undisciplined convicts he had abandoned the night before. These were hardened, blood-soaked killers, and their stares were filled with a cold, murderous, absolute truth. They knew exactly what he was. And standing in the center of them all, bleeding from his shoulder, but completely unbroken, was Sergeant Marcus Vance. A cold, terrifying sweat broke out under Crawford's polished helmet. The tactical genius he had tried to bury in the mud had just pulled off the impossible. The arithmetic of the situation hit Crawford with the force of a physical blow. If Vance and these penal soldiers made it back to division headquarters and testified, Crawford would not just lose his command. He would face a firing squad for cowardice in the face of the enemy and the deliberate sabotage of a communications radio. The coward's mind raced, relying on the only weapon the aristocratic establishment truly respected: an absolute, bureaucratic destruction. He had to silence Vance immediately, before a single official word could be spoken to the arriving brass. He had to strike first, and he had to use the full weight of his rank to crush the truth. Crawford marched forward, his face contorting into a mask of manufactured righteous fury. He ignored the dead enemy soldiers. He ignored the wounded Americans. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger directly at the exhausted black sergeant. "Military police, secure that man," Crawford barked, his voice shrill and desperate against the grim, heavy silence of the ridge. "Arrest Sergeant Vance immediately. I am officially charging him with gross insubordination, mutiny, and the deliberate destruction of the command radio during an active firefight. Strip his weapon and put him in irons." The two military police officers, fresh from the rear and completely ignorant of the night's slaughter, unholstered their sidearms and stepped forward. They pulled heavy steel cuffs from their belts, moving toward the bleeding hero who had just saved the entire sector, ready to bind him like an animal. Crawford stood tall, a sneer returning to his face. He was confident that the natural order of his universe, where the powerful effortlessly crush the righteous, and the truth is buried under paperwork, was being violently restored. He fully expected the white penal troops to simply drop their heads and look away, just like they always did. After all, in Crawford's arrogant mind, they were just white convicts, and Vance was just a black outcast. The system always wins. But Captain Arthur Crawford had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He was operating on the rules of yesterday. He did not realize that the prejudiced, broken men of Echo Company had all died on this hill last night in the artillery fire, and the men who had been resurrected in their place answered to a completely different authority. The two military police officers moved toward Sergeant Marcus Vance, their heavy boots sloshing in the blood-soaked mud. They unlatched their steel handcuffs, fully expecting the disgraced black soldier to submit to the overwhelming authority of the United States military. Vance did not reach for his weapon. He did not argue. He simply lowered his tired eyes, his chest heaving, and slowly extended his wrists. He knew how the machine worked. You could survive the enemy's bullets, but you could never outshoot the bureaucracy. Captain Arthur Crawford smiled, a thin, venomous line across his face. He had won. The scapegoat was secured. The narrative was his to write, and his cowardice would be buried forever under a mountain of medals. But then, a sound cut through the muggy morning air. It was not the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. It was the sharp, unmistakable, metallic clack of a rifle bolt chambering a heavy .30 caliber round. Crawford blinked, his smile faltering. He slowly turned his head toward the trench line. Standing there, leaning heavily on a shattered rifle stock to keep his weight off his ruined leg, was Miller. The heavily tattooed penal soldier, the man who had spent months making Vance's life a living hell, was pointing a captured enemy assault rifle directly at the center of Captain Crawford's pristine chest. Miller's hands were not shaking. His eyes were dead, hollow, and absolutely devoid of fear. "Get your hands off our commander," Miller growled, his voice a hoarse, guttural rasp that carried across the ridge. Crawford's face drained of color. "Soldier, lower your weapon immediately. That is a direct order. You are committing treason." Before Crawford could finish his sentence, the ridge erupted in a synchronized, terrifying symphony of mechanical clicks. Clack, 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 clack. Every single surviving white soldier of Echo Company stood up from the mud. 30 men, covered in soot and the blood of 100 enemies, raised their M16s, their machine guns, and their captured ordnance. They did not aim at the jungle. They aimed their muzzles directly at Captain Crawford, the two military police officers, and the combat photographer. They formed a tight, impenetrable wall of steel and flesh around Marcus Vance. The two MPs instantly froze, their hands hovering over the handcuffs. They looked at the eyes of the penal troops. They were heavily outnumbered by men who had just survived 8 hours of absolute hell. Men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I said. Miller repeated, spitting a mixture of saliva and blood into the mud at Crawford's polished boots. "Get off our hill, Captain, before we add 3 more bodies to the pile." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing on that mountain. It was the sound of a systemic paradigm violently snapping in half. Crawford looked at the ring of weapons pointed at his head. He looked at the white men who had chosen a disgraced black outcast over the aristocratic establishment. The realization crashed over him. He had absolutely no power here. His rank, his pedigree, his connections in Washington, they meant absolutely nothing in the face of men who had found their own terrifying truth in the dark. Trembling, Crawford slowly took a step backward. He nodded to the MPs. Without a word, the military police holstered their weapons and backed away, their hands raised defensively. Crawford turned and practically ran down the muddy slope toward the waiting helicopters, leaving his dignity and his narrative
burning in the dirt behind him.
But you will never read about this standoff in any history book. When the division brass realized what had happened on Hill 81, they panicked. They could not court-martial an entire company of white soldiers for defending a black officer without the terrifying truth of Crawford's cowardice and the catastrophic failure of their own intelligence leaking to the American press. So the establishment did what it always does. It sanitized the mess. Echo Company was quietly and immediately disbanded. The surviving soldiers were scattered to dozens of different units across the globe, explicitly threatened with federal prison if they ever spoke a word about the mutiny. Captain Crawford was quietly transferred to a desk job in the Pentagon, far away from any real danger. And Sergeant Marcus Vance? They could not give him a medal, because that would require admitting he was there. They could not put him in jail, because he was a hero. So, they simply erased him. He was quietly given a medical discharge and sent back to Detroit with a bus ticket and a meager pension. Officially unrecorded as the commander of the most brilliant defensive stand of the entire campaign. History is a comfortable lie, carefully curated by men in clean uniforms. But if you know where to look, if you dig beneath the redacted files and the polished marble monuments, you will find the truth. It lives in the quiet, unbreakable dignity of men like Marcus Vance. Men who were handed a broken system, thrown into the fire, and chose to forge it into a weapon of absolute, undeniable excellence. They may have erased his name from the reports, but out there, in the choking heat of the San Dior jungle, the ghost of Echo Company still holds the line. And they take orders from only one man,